Hey guys, I'm here with John AKBARI. How are you, John?
Good. Good morning.
Good morning to you too. So I'm going to introduce John briefly and then we'll jump right into the questions. So John is Chief Revenue Officer at 3Forge and running his own business as well, helping companies with their go-to-market strategy and sales. He doubled year-over-year revenues at a monitoring vendor and accelerated the sales cycle 2 times. His close rate was 80% and he had 67% new business. He also accelerated the 50 million euro acquisition by the Carlyle Group. In addition to sales and marketing, John is passionate about extremely big data, real-time analytics, AI, cloud, SaaS, mobile, machine learning, monitoring, and visualization. And he's also a music buff, a baker, and a biker.
Right.
So welcome, John.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here, man.
Let's start with the first question. So tell us a little bit more about consultative selling. What is that?
Great question. Basically, I guess what I've kind of really been focusing on the last few years is almost the use of both consultative and how it's a little bit different from challenger sales, which is an idea that's kind of related a bit different. So consultative generally is a kind of a discussion with a prospect where you as a salesperson leading on behalf of a vendor are talking and trying to solve a challenge that your customer has in a mutual way. One, of course, to do that, you've got to have already a relationship or credibility through a previous relationship introduction or what have you. So it starts from a very different place. There's a mutual understanding and credibility. Challenger is interesting, and I think very relevant as the world changes and sales has changed in the last 5 to 10 years, where so much information is immediately available to potential buyers. So in that case, you may not be a known vendor if you're a startup or so, or it's a new initiative for a larger vendor. The challenge there is generally you don't have an established relationship. There isn't necessarily a lot of credibility walking in. So you've got to really be much more focused, approaching a prospect with a solution and the impact to the business in particular. I think that's a key difference. And what I'm finding in working with startups is the challenger approach is what really builds a pipeline, helps qualify, and really significantly grow revenues quickly.
How would you say B2B software sales are different in the financial services as opposed to other industries?
I guess the biggest thing there, and I'm not saying it's the only industry, but the first thing that comes to mind is regulatory and compliance issues. In other words, lots of companies and lots of industries have legacy technology, which is a challenge to integrate. Moving to cloud is itself a huge task. Lots of areas have that, but compliance and regulatory is particularly challenging because it's a lot of work. The specs are very poorly defined. They're usually written by lawyers, honestly, not technology people. So it's not specific like a recipe. It's just kind of like you have to show us you can, prove something or audit something. So even implementing those rules and regulations can be quite challenging. And at the end of the day, it's a lot of cost. Storing data for 7 to 10 years, providing analytics and reporting. All of these are huge costs that don't actually help our customer, for a salesperson, make money. So it's essentially mandatory. It's very complicated and something that, if you've done it a few times as a vendor in a very specific use case, you get then you kind of earn the credibility because you have a solution. You can walk in and say, we've done this before. But bootstrapping is very hard and an interesting challenge, to say the least.
Cool. What would you say are the 3 top qualities that a salesperson should have?
I would say right now that I guess the first things that come to mind are, number one, be curious. Learning, obviously, the first things that come to mind about technologies, about migration to cloud analytics, and all those are kind of the really obvious ones. But I think the kind of technologies and shifts that we're seeing today are completely different in terms of business models and the like. So you may get an idea from one industry, particularly if you've been able to close a deal, and take the idea of how you priced it, the business model, the concept now of shared risk reward is very different. So you might take something from one industry that you might say, retail has nothing to do with trading, or what we do in equities is completely different from fixed income or foreign exchange. But again, you can bring ideas, solutions, the way you presented it, the value, and if you're curious and can map that, which I guess is my second kind of thing that comes to mind, which is being inventive. How do you map one scenario, one challenge to another, and bring the ideas forward and translate them and convert them? But that's key. And then, of course, the last thing is always in sales is to be persistent. Not necessarily saying the same email with the same pitch, but giving variation, giving some time in between each reach out that you make with a prospect, because there is so much noise, so many emails and webinars and things, that sort of rising above that and getting through the wall of noise is an ongoing challenge too.
I've read some interesting research that was saying that one of the biggest problems was that salespeople would contact companies too much. So how would you spread out those contact points, those touch points?
I think it varies by whether you're approaching technology people or business, and also the level. It's hard to give an exact number unless we're talking about a very specific case, but I think you got to give a week to 2 weeks maybe in between reach outs, and the key thing is, of course, to be very different in the subject, if it's an email, in the subject line, if it's a LinkedIn message and what have you. So when I say persistent, it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing over and over again. That's a big no-no, I think. I think it's if you vary it, and if you can put a one-sentence mention or reference to the previous thing, because one of the other things I think we see in what we're doing is the second, third, fourth reach out is if they can kind of be, if the reader says, yeah, I remember that email, or I've even had it on the phone. Yeah, I remember, you sent me something, or I saw a webinar. So you want to help your reader who's extremely busy and has short attention span to connect those dots. And I think, for example, if you were to do an email blast and you announce a win or participation in an event, again, you want that person to connect it. So that's, not the thing you lead with, but that's huge, because then you're beginning to build credibility simply by repeated exposure.
Right. Okay. Who would you say are the sales geniuses that you've learned from? Some people that inspired you?
Oh, quite a few. I guess the one that I always think of is my first boss when I was at Tibco years ago. Simply because he was very patient, asking a lot of questions, and I was perhaps even more aggressive about asking questions in those days. So just, why when the prospect, we walked in, we said hello, and the prospect said, how much is this going to cost? And I had prepared, I was an SE then, before I became directly a sales guy. And I'd say, like, well, we had all the information, why didn't we give it to him? And then he would explain the logic of, confirming certain things, challenging back on other questions we had, and so forth. So it wasn't, I guess in a nutshell, he was very good explaining how sales is not linear, and how you're always dealing with personalities, politics, and things, which, if you have an engineering background, is not immediately obvious. I think it's not the same scenario over and over again. And
finally, what would you say are the top 3 pieces of advice that you would give to other people in terms of sales, B2B sales?
Well, number 1, work backwards. Meaning start from the end state of what your customer needs, how you can help, what you've done in the past that worked. I just find it sounds crazy, and especially again with engineers, they may say, well, no, you start with a problem and you go to the solution. It's like, if you kind of know where you need to be, it'll help you prioritize what you're working on. It'll help you qualify your pipeline, what leads to pursue. It'll even help you, it will very much help you figure out when and how to engage a partner if that's what you need. And even things like pricing and business models and the shared risk reward idea. So that's 1, work backwards. 2, cliche, I know, but customer success always comes first. That doesn't mean you give away, pricing and give them every term that the customer wants, because that's, it's got to win on both sides. But I think, fanatically successful, fanatically happy customers are going to, they'll start calling you with referrals and references rather than you're having to go ask them constantly and all that. So really start from their mindset, and then again, work backwards into what you can do to help. And then the last thing, I guess, is kind of going back to the curiosity theme, is always be asking questions. Again, not the same question over and over again necessarily, but different ways to kind of solicit and confirm the information. Because one of the things I think we're finding out in our work as we increasingly focus on selling to very senior business people is the first answer you get is only the first answer, meaning it's not the definitive answer, and particularly if it's not quite as positive as you were hoping to get, you've got to help your customer sort of move in the direction of understanding the impact, measuring the risk and the reward, helping your prospects see how you're probably the best organization to help them get there, and focus on the positives of where they can go, as opposed to, gosh, you know, what happens if all these bad things happen on the way there? So, you know, the first answer is not the definitive answer.
So I wanted to ask you one more question. What kind of music do you like?
Oh, well, I like a lot. Everything from classical to opera to chamber music and orchestral stuff. You know, James Brown, R&B, so a lot of stuff. Some of the more recent things, maybe I'm not quite there yet, let's say.
And what do you like to bake?
Oh, well, I bake with my wife, and we do cookies and some pies and, you know, basic things. But it's kind of, even once in a while it comes to mind about how, you know, a recipe, you know, when you're trying to refine your sales process and think all these details, you can be extremely specific, and yet there's a little art, there's a little variation on something. So be ready for those, you know, those little changes. So it does kind of keep your mind open and looking at, you know, variations on how to do things.
And that's a fun activity to do. Plus, you get some delicious food at the end. So
yeah, you got to eat it too at the end. Right. Share with other people.
John, thank you so much for doing this. It's been a pleasure. It's been a blast. And I'm sure it's been very valuable for people watching this as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Matt. Appreciate the opportunity.
Have a great day.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.